करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती है झर झर, अनवरत झरती झर झर झर, तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधारस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधारस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी, तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी। हम अज्ञान वश करते मना, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यह प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यह प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा। माँ हमें वह पाठ सिखा। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती झर झर झर, तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधारस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधारस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके माँ।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. The love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This devotional song, Karunavari Hai Mirambike, in the melodious voice of Mithu, is addressing the Mother as the compassionate, the all-merciful, and the devotee is highly dependent on that mercy and is asking for her heart to be filled with love for the divine. And love for the divine is the one emotion that the Mother had said is worth retaining. The only emotion worth retaining is love, and the only object of love should be the divine. And of course, that includes all creation of the divine, because the creation is also another form of the divine itself. So, seeing the divine in all creation, love all creation, our fellow beings, and also animals, plants, and even dead matter. The mother has emphasized a lot about using matter with respect, with love, with care. And it's a common observation that if we do that, the objects that we are using last much longer, behave much better, they function properly. With that, we turn to today's session, which is the last session in the S.03 course. It's the last session, but that doesn't mean that our relationship will end. The relationship will continue through other courses and through the other events that the S program will keep coming up with. Today's session is about consciousness. It's a vast subject, and all the volumes have been written on it. Nobody knows too much about it. Remains a mysterious subject, but all the same, it's an interesting subject for the general public, for all of us, as well as for scientists. Consciousness, loosely speaking, means awareness. And this awareness is about our surroundings, about what we know, about our capacity to do something, and our deciding to do something. All this comes under the broad umbrella of being aware. And all this is what consciousness is. But then our awareness as an individual is only a very small fraction of everything that we can be aware of. It's only a small fraction of the total reality. So the reality as we perceive it is only a partial reality, and when reality is partial, it is also likely to be distorted. Because then, we get it gets skewed in favor of what we can perceive and what our personal bias is. And therefore, it is both partial and distorted. And this is what we call is the mental consciousness. And in spiritual literature, we spell this type of a mental consciousness with a small c. In contrast with this is the mystic consciousness, which is aware of the total reality and therefore is much higher, wider, and deeper. In a way, this entire journey from the mental consciousness to the mystic consciousness is what the journey of yoga is about. It looks like a small change from a small c to a capital C. That's how the mystic consciousness is spelled with a capital C. Looks like a small change, but then that is what the evolutionary thrust on the planet is about. Matter expressing only a very small fraction of this total consciousness of the Supreme, and those creatures which have a life expressing a little more, and those which have a mind expressing still more, and man being the latest product of that process, but certainly not the final product. So the evolutionary thrust is about expressing more of the Supreme Consciousness hidden even in dead matter. And the mystic consciousness is the awareness of the total reality. And between the two is a vast spectrum, and somewhere on this spectrum, we all are. And the journey of yoga is about moving towards that larger consciousness and reaching that goal finally, hopefully one day in some life, where the consciousness can be spelled with a capital C. So it looks like a small change from a small c to a capital C, and yet what a long journey it is and what a profound difference it makes. Now, turning to the view of consciousness in modern science. Modern science considers this consciousness, whatever our awareness is at the mental level, to be an emergent property of the brain, which means it somehow emerges from the activity of the brain. The activity of the brain means the electrical activity in the nerve cells and the chemicals that they release, but for transmitting the messages from one nerve cell to the next. And somehow these minute electrical changes and the release of these small amounts of chemicals is what gives rise to consciousness. Somehow. And that somehow gets camouflaged in different ways. But really speaking, science does not understand that. That remains an area of ignorance. But all the same, science continues to believe that the awareness is an emergent property of the brain. On the other hand, from the spiritual point of view, we consider the brain also to be a part of the material frame which has been given to us for a purpose. And the purpose of the brain is to channelize a small fraction of the total consciousness. So it is only a channelizer, a utilizer, but not a generator of consciousness. Now you can argue that, well, if a person's brain is dead, the person is not aware of anything. Even before the brain is completely dead, when the brain is knocked out, uh, the person goes into a coma. The person is not aware. The person is alive but cannot be aroused, is not aware of anything. And therefore, if the brain is not functioning, the person is not aware. Therefore, awareness resides in the brain. But then one can argue back that the bulb, the electrical bulb, is only channelizing the electricity. It is not the generator of electricity. And it has been constructed in such a way that it will be able to convert this electrical energy into light. But all the same, it is only a it's only a channelizer of the electrical energy. And therefore, if we say that if there is no bulb, there will be no light, doesn't prove that the bulb is the source of the light. The source of the light still is the electricity that flows through it. If the electricity doesn't flow, the bulb is of no use. So, uh, therefore, the another corollary from this is that if we want to understand electricity, we cannot understand it by dissecting the bulb. No amount of dissection of the bulb will reveal to us the secrets of electricity. For that, we have to turn somewhere else. In the same way, no amount of study of the brain, as modern science does, will actually be able to tell us the secrets of consciousness. The secrets of consciousness have been perceived by the rishis and the mystics across traditions uh, through another route, which is beyond the senses. And that is the way they have been able to uh, uh, perceive that deeper, higher, and wider reality. Now, therefore, you can argue both ways, but all the same, no amount of rational analysis can prove or disprove what the seat of consciousness is. And we have the choice of either going on believing that one day the modern methods of science will be able to tell us how the minute electrical changes and the release of minute amounts of chemicals in the brain can translate into a subjective experience. One day we will understand it, or we can uh, believe the rishis and the mystics who have been able to see it through another route by achieving what may be called a leap of consciousness. A leap of consciousness which enables them to see a, the possibility of a non material entity uh, giving uh, way to a material process, a material structure. Now, this is what the rishis and the mystics have perceived. And on a miniature scale, it is happening in our brain all the time. The universal energy, which is non material in nature, is able to uh, make or express a small fraction of it through a material structure, which is in the brain. So, this type of a to and fro uh, sort of a connection, the non material giving rise to the non material channelizing through a material entity, and the material processes or physical processes giving rise to a subjective experience. This type of a to and fro thing has happened at the beginning of the universe when the non material divine, which had not yet created matter, uh, expressed itself as matter. So there was that link. And something similar is happening on a miniature scale in our mental consciousness too. So with this, let's turn to the PowerPoint. So this is our concluding session, and we are concluding it consciously. The YES program is a part of the celebrations of the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. I'll start with Oliver Wendell Holmes, with whom many of the previous sessions also started. And you would have seen that he was a poet, and many of the lines that I shared at the beginning of some of the previous sessions were from one of his long poems in the aristocrat or of the breakfast table. Now today we'll turn to one more poem of his, which is again a very interesting poem based on probably an inspiration that he got someday about an idea. The idea that he got was that if there could be a machine in which different parts were so good that they would not break down, but all the same, the machine having a limited life would one day stop functioning all at the same time. Then what would that machine be like? And with this idea, he wrote this poem, The One Horse Shay. Now, this horse shay are not standard words. Horse is horse, and shay is chaise. So, chaise is a carriage which is pulled by a horse, generally has two wheels, and in which one or two people can sit. So, he is talking about a carriage, a horse pulled carriage with the two wheels, and this sort of pronunciation, the horse shay, would be how what the provincial accent would be like in some parts of England, not or the US. He was an American, not the standard BBC or Voice of America accent, but all the same, this is what he meant: the one horse shay. And this particular horse carriage about which this poem was built with excellent material so that it will last 100 years. Each of the parts will have a lifespan of 100 years. With time, they'll keep wearing out and they'll stop functioning after 100 years. But since none of the parts will stop functioning somewhere midway, there'll be no breakdown. You know, we have seen that in automobiles, sometimes there's a breakdown and it needs a change of some part, and you change that part and the vehicle starts running again. So that's a breakdown. But this type of vehicle will not break down. So it will wear out, but will not break down. And after 100 years, each of the parts would have worn out to the extent that the machine will just stop functioning. So the poem is very long. What I'll do is only show you a few lines of it. And if you feel interested in reading the whole of it and some other poems which are also there in this book, the companion poems, How the Old Horse Won the Bet and The Broomstick Train, if you feel like reading these, you can always turn to this URL on the slide on which this book is available for free download. So the one horse shay. Have you heard of the wonderful one horse shay that was built in such a logical way? It ran 100 years to a day, and then of a sudden it but stay. I'll tell you what happened without delay. So it ran perfectly for 100 years, and then all of a sudden what happened? The poet says, I'll tell you, just wait a while. And what happened was, it scared the parson into fits. And the parson was the one who was riding it, a church priest. And he got scared when it happened, all of a sudden, frightening people out of their wits. Have you ever heard of that, I say? And then it goes to the history when this was to be built, how the best of material, the best of wood, the best of iron and everything was collected so that there'll be no breakdown. Each part will be perfectly crafted with the best possible material, and it was designed to last 100 years. So do I tell you, I rather guess she was a wonder and nothing less. So when it was finally built with that material, it was a wonderful thing to look at. And here it is, it's ready. The one horse chaise, and to describe its longevity, how long it went on working, says corkscrew horses' beards turned grey. So little horses grew into adult horses. Young people who had beards, their beards turned grey. Deacon and deaconess dropped away. People died while the vehicle kept running. Children and grandchildren, where were they? So the children and the grandchildren, they grew up into adults. They were no longer children anymore. But there stood the stout old one-horse chaise. But this carriage went on functioning as fresh as on Lisbon earthquake day. Little of all we value here wakes on the morn of its 100th year, without both feeling and looking queer. Beautiful sentence about the aging process, that little of all we value in this world wakes on the morn of its 100th year. It's generally dead and gone by the 100th year. And before that happens, it both feels and looks rather queer. In fact, there's nothing that keeps its youth, so far as I know, but a tree and truth. So there are only two things that keep their youth. One is a tree and the other is truth. Again, beautiful selection of two words that keep their youth everlasting, even beyond the 100th year. This is a moral that runs at large. Take it, you're welcome, no extra charge. And here is that beautiful one-horse carriage running beautiful with the parson riding it. And then what happened one day, exactly 100 years later? All at once, the horse stood still because the carriage started rumbling. All at once, the horse stood still close by the meeting house on the hill. First a shiver and then a thrill, then something decidedly like a spill. You see, of course, if you're not a dunce, how it went to pieces all at once. All at once and nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. So here it is, the carriage all crumbled, the parson, poor parson, scared and in fits, scared out of his wits, landing on the floor, and left with only the horse and no carriage. End of the wonderful one-horse chaise. Logic is logic. That's all I say. So they were built very logically, as I said in the beginning, at each part to last 100 years. So what type of machine do you think is the human body? Is it like the one-horse chaise or like the ordinary automobiles which keep having breakdowns? We are more like the ordinary automobile in the sense that we all have a weak point. All our parts are not designed to last exactly the same duration. And that's why one person is more likely to get a peptic ulcer and another person more likely to get a heart disease, and yet a third is more likely to get diabetes or a migraine. And so we keep getting some breakdowns, hiccups here and there because of the weak points in the body. And what we would like actually is that we should have a machine more like the one-horse chaise, or the one-horse chaise. We should have something like that so that we keep functioning beautifully throughout life. And then at the end of it, we don't mind if all the parts just stop functioning and we have a sudden painless death. Now we turn to today's subject, consciousness. There are two types of consciousness, small c and a capital C. Consciousness is awareness. When we spell it with a capital C, it is total awareness. And these are the two poles of consciousness. This is the ordinary mental consciousness, which is based primarily on sensory experience and sensory perception and past experience and memory, etc. We put all this together to construct a certain picture of reality. And at the other extreme is the mystic consciousness, which includes the mental consciousness. This person is also aware of whatever is around and uses the past experience and memory to construct a certain picture of a partial reality. But then within this, behind it and above it, he has a much wider, limitless awareness of a truth which has no boundaries, which is not confined to time and space. And that's why these dots, they keep getting uh, more and more diffuse and sparse as you go, but there's no clear boundary where these dots stop. And so this indicates that infinite expansion that this person experiences. So the mystic experiences uh, an enormous expansion of consciousness, so that the consciousness uh, merges with the awareness which has no limits, which is not confined in time and space, and that he feels and finds and knows is behind this manifestation, which is the form of the mental consciousness. So what we perceive at the mental level is a manifestation, is another form of this higher, wider, and deeper consciousness. Now, do the scientists really understand consciousness? These question marks indicate the black box, the area of ignorance. We see a flower for which we use the eyes. We have receptors which are sensitive to light here, the rods and cones, and we know in detail the pathway that finally takes this to the part of the brain which becomes active when we look at a flower. The activity here increases and we become aware of a flower. But then all that is happening here is a set of physicochemical changes, electrical impulses, and release of certain chemicals, the neurotransmitters, and the experience is subjective in nature. How these physicochemical changes translate into the experience of a pretty flower, we do not know. Now, this then leads to a certain desire, a thought that I want this. Now, this desire or this thought is also something subjective, and this then translates into changes in another part of the brain. Now, science would have it that I want it. This decision has also been taken by some part of the brain, which then transmits it to the area where action actually starts for making it possible to pluck the flower. But then, if you look at it, even in ordinary language, we often say that a thought came to me, an idea occurred to me, which means the thought came from outside. It came from somewhere, and I became a channel for giving an expression to that thought. So we say a thought came to me. And spiritually speaking, actually, that is very true, because the thought comes to us from the universal consciousness, and the brain is only a channelizer of it. It's an instrument which has been constructed in such a way that it is able to channelize certain categories and a certain fraction of whatever is there in the universal consciousness. So it channelizes it. And therefore we say a thought came to me. But then after a while we start saying, I think. So then, we feel as if I generated the thought. So we start with a thought came to me, and then we say, I think. So we appropriate the thought. An idea occurred to me, an idea came to me, and then we say my idea. So we appropriate that. And since it was my idea, I also want an intellectual property right on it. So we are very quick at possessing and appropriating. So the person says, I want it. And then this subjective decision, subjective desire is correlated, associated with a certain activity in a certain part of the brain, from where nerve cells carry it to the spinal cord, and from there another nerve cell carries it to the muscles, which need to contract to pluck the flower. Here's a quote from Sri Aurobindo, which basically is trying to say that the the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but only a channelizer. Even for our ordinary thought and consciousness, these organs, that is the sensory organs, the nerves, and the brain, are only there. This comes in a previous sentence, so that's why it has not been repeated in this sentence by him. Even for our ordinary thought and consciousness, these organs are only their habitual instruments and not their generators. They are the instruments habitually used for channelizing the consciousness, channelizing a certain fraction of the consciousness. Now, there have been scientists who have engaged in these studies on consciousness, particularly during the last 100 years or so. And in this category, the first ones to enter this field were the physicists, and then jumped onto the bandwagon of the neurophysiologists. And among the latest are the clinicians, the doctors who come in contact with patients. The physicists entered it because certain findings in modern physics, theoretical physics as it's sometimes called, or atomic physics, certain findings in that area were quite consistent with the spiritual worldview. Now, this is a level of physics that I do not understand. And without understanding much, I may just repeat, parrot fashion, that if the spin of an electron changes in New Delhi, there can be a corresponding change in the spin of an electron in New York. So across distance, there can be an effect because of something happening here. So there's a cause and effect relationship between two events separated by a long distance, and the transmission is without any physical medium, does not require any physical medium, and the transmission is instantaneous, immediate, and it's unmitigated. That is, it does not reduce in intensity because of the distance. So this type of a transmission is possible. And one way of explaining this is through a unified field of consciousness. That is, the consciousness of the Supreme pervades everything, and therefore different modes of consciousness can communicate. For example, an individual here in New Delhi is a manifestation of the same Supreme Consciousness of which another individual in the United States is, and therefore the two are separated, but all the same, this separation is illusory. Even the air gap that separates them is also a manifestation of the same Supreme Consciousness. So there is no real breach in continuity from one individual here, the air separating them, and the other individual on the other side of the globe. So there's no real breach of continuity, no absolute breach of continuity. And this is something which is, in fact, what spirituality in a way is about. And the physicists found this phenomenon of the electron spin of electrons getting affecting the spin of another electron a long distance away. And this was found to be consistent with the spiritual worldview. And therefore, many physicists got interested in it, and some physicists like Fritjof Capra, he was one of the pioneers, ended up writing books on it, popular paperbacks like the Tao of Physics. But this is something which I will not dwell on much, because this is something which I don't fully understand and not aware of it. But all the same, these scientists were careful in emphasizing that modern physics has not really proven or disproved the spiritual worldview, but has some findings which are consistent with the spiritual worldview. And they also came up with alternative explanations which do not require the spiritual worldview. So with that caution and with that precision of language, let's try to understand that science, even physics, did not really end up proving the spiritual worldview. And in fact, no scientific studies have been able to do it, because the methods of science are not only inadequate, but also inappropriate for understanding the link between the material and the non-material. I'll turn instead to the next category of scientists, the neurophysiologists, and concentrate on a few neurophysiological studies. And let me start with paying my regards to these three gentlemen, all three of my teachers at the Department of Physiology in the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. Dr. B.K. Anand, the founder, head of the Department of Physiology at AIIMS, and who continued to be the Professor Emeritus till he left this world. Dr. Baldev Singh, who started his career at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences at the age of 60 plus, because there was no other neurologist available at that time in the country. And that's how, as a special case, he was appointed as the founder head of the Department of Neurology. And then after retirement, he joined the Department of Physiology as an emeritus professor and continued to be there almost till the end. He had to leave a little before he left the world because of failing eyesight. 1904 born, and went on working at the institute till about 1992, that's 88, and left this world in 1998 at the age of 94. Professor Gulzar Singh Sheena, another scientist who went on to become the head of the Department of Physiology and retired in 1986 and continued to work in the United States at the Ohio State University in Columbus, even post-retirement, till he was almost 90. Now, these three scientists, they did some pioneering studies on yogis, advanced yogis, and it's very difficult to get them because most yogis are not interested in this type of studies. They don't want to volunteer. And as Professor Chena used to say, that many of those yogis said that you scientists are glorified fools. Because the yogi feels, that this is something which is beyond scientific research. And just by looking at hooking us to some instruments and finding a little change here and a little change there, they think that they have studied us and they have studied our consciousness. The scientists can't do that because all they have done is found some correlates, something associated. And associations do not prove cause and effect relationship. Just because you find some changes in the brain happening at the same time at which the yogi is having a certain experience, it does not mean that that electrical change which you have observed is actually responsible for, is the cause, and the change in consciousness, the state of consciousness, is the effect. You cannot have a cause and effect relationship. You cannot deduce a cause and effect relationship from a mere association. And what is really happening in the yogi is within. It is more of inner work and inner change, and that is something which cannot be measured. Inner work is not visible, and so is inner change not quantifiable. You cannot say that the person's consciousness has now gone up by 1 kilo or by 1 kilometer. You can't measure it that way. And therefore, the yogis, he said, you consider us glorified fools. And one yogi actually told them that. But all the same, they did did some pioneering studies, which are still quoted in the 1960s. And I'll show you one of those, which is relevant to the field of consciousness, on yogis when they were not meditating and when they were meditating and were therefore going through some peak sort of level of consciousness, some peak experience, or at least they were in a state of consciousness which was far above the ordinary mental consciousness. Now, these are the electroencephalograms, the EEGs, before meditation and during meditation. Now, before meditation, when the person is relaxed and inattentive, mentally not very active, the EEG shows this alpha rhythm, which has these waves, which are rather big in amplitude and low in frequency. But if you distract the person, you invite the person's attention, make the person pay attention by, say, a bang, a clap, some sound or a vibration, say by applying a tuning fork on somewhere on the body, and a tuning fork vibrates, a metallic thing which vibrates. So you expose the person to a vibration, or you uh, have a tube, a test tube, glass test tube, having some hot water in it, and you touch it somewhere on the body. So by any of these sensory stimuli, you find that this alpha rhythm is blocked. It gets replaced by the beta rhythm, which has low amplitude. The waves are small, but they are more frequent, by high frequency, low amplitude EEG. So this is what happens to ordinary people. This is what happened to these yogis also before meditation. But when they were meditating, something interesting happened, and the bang or the vibration of the hot tube could not disturb the alpha rhythm, could not block the alpha rhythm. It did not get replaced by the beta rhythm. It continued, which means that the yogis were in a state of consciousness in which none of these things could distract them. It could not they could not be bothered less. So they could remain completely immune to the effects of these sensory stimuli. So this was an altered state of consciousness. Now, one might say that they had worked on their consciousness in such a way, and during meditation, they were in a state of consciousness in which they could not be disturbed by these sensory stimuli. So these yogic practices were the cause, and this altered consciousness was the effect. But then people have also argued the other way. It is quite possible that people who have this type of a tendency not to get distracted are the ones who are attracted to yoga. So this was something inherent, and it is not the effect of the yogic practices. So you can look at it either way. So you can see the type of logic into which science and our rationality tends to go. So really, you cannot prove a cause and effect relationship even through this association between the yogis and this phenomenon. Whether it is the yogic practices leading to this effect, or it is this type of a tendency which was inbuilt in them. They were different from ordinary people. They were constructed differently. They were made differently, which made them turn to yoga. And maybe many others may be having this ability, but have not turned to yoga, and we have not studied them, which is something which can emerge only through large-scale controlled studies. And therefore, in science, you can really never prove or disprove anything. Everything remains a subject of doubt and discussion. There have been other studies following that on the same lines and different. One of the studies that made headlines was brain imaging studies. That is, studies which reveal what is happening in which part of the brain. Now, these are studies which go beyond the ordinary EEG. These are studies which are done through the study of blood flow through the brain, like say PET studies and so on. So these are studies which are actually imaging the brain, studying which part of the brain is active and which part is inactive during a certain state of consciousness. So they did these brain imaging studies on some nuns while they were praying, and on meditating Buddhists. And they've told them that when you go through a certain peak experience, just give us a little indication so that we would know. So, they could correlate the change in their brain images, that is, which part of the brain is active or inactive, with the type of experience that these nuns or these Buddhist monks were having. And on the basis of their findings, they finally ended up coming with a book with the tantalizing title, Why God Won't Go Away. What they found was that during peak spiritual experience, the activity in areas of the brain concerned with attention to sensory stimuli decreased. That is, the areas which normally become active when we are paying attention to sensory stimuli, the activity in those parts of the brain decreased. So, this corresponds with those EEG studies. The parts of the brain which are active when we pay attention to sensory stimuli, they were less active. And this corresponds with the yogi not getting disturbed by these sensory stimuli. On the other hand, some other parts of the brain became more active. So it appears as if those parts which can give us those type of peak experiences normally remain suppressed because of all types of sensory stimuli. But when the yogi or the monk or the nun goes into a meditative state, then the areas of the brain which pay attention to sensory stimuli or which have increased activity during sensory attention to sensory stimuli, their activity goes down. And when that activity goes down, as if by default, some other parts of the brain which are correlated with that peak spiritual experience, they become more active. So the brain is wired in such a way that if this part is active, the part which is engaged in activity when we are paying attention to sensory stimuli, when that is active, the other part remains suppressed. If we reduce this, then by default, the other part becomes more active, and that is correlated with that peak spiritual experience. Now, these findings, the interpretation of the scientists was that since the perception of a supraphysical reality by the meditating nun or monk correlates with a change in the pattern of activity in the brain, and the activity in a certain part of the brain increases, it's quite possible that that is the part that is responsible for or is channelizing the perception of that higher reality. So it's consistent with the spiritual worldview. It is also consistent with the existence of a supraphysical reality. So it is consistent with it. Consistent with it does not mean that it has proven the existence of God or that supraphysical reality. It is consistent with it because there is a certain change in the pattern of the brain activity during that experience. So there's a correlate. Now there's an association. The association does not prove a cause and effect relationship. The association does not prove the existence of God. So their interpretation was pretty cautious, but some spiritual enthusiasts jumped at it and said that, see, now science has proven the existence of God. Science cannot prove it, and the science cannot disprove it. These findings were only consistent with that, the existence of that supraphysical reality. Now, how about the clinical studies? These clinical studies have been of many types, using yogic practices for treatment of heart disease, etc. But those are not the ones which are really so relevant to consciousness. What is more relevant to consciousness are the studies on prayer, the effects of prayer on healing, because that is what is happening is that the healing intentions, noble intentions, good intentions of one individual are having an effect on another individual. So one person's mind is affecting another person's body. The well-wisher's mind, while praying, is able to affect the patient's body which is sick. Now, when these studies have shown mildly positive results, and one person who has done a lot of service to this area is Larry Dossey, a physician trained in modern scientific medicine, but then who has put together a lot of work in this area in a large number of paperbacks, and one of them is shown here, Reinventing Medicine. So these effects of prayer are, generally speaking, positive, although weak. But then the scientific argument against these studies has been that there is, in fact, a mind-body relationship. That is, the person's mind can affect his own body. And when the person knows that I am being prayed for by somebody, then the person feels that I will get better. And because the person thinks that I'll get better, he actually gets better. So it is the patient's mind healing the patient's body. The prayer has nothing to do with it. And in this area, this is an argument which is very difficult to counteract. And therefore, what has been more helpful are animal studies. And one of the well-known animal studies is on rats, in which an incision was given, and it was found that the incision healed much faster if somebody, a healer, held that cage in the hands for 15 minutes a day and prayed for the quick healing of the wound. But one might say that the rats which had the incision were also enjoying this extra attention. And so it was the rat's mind influencing the rat's body. Then there have been plant studies. Can the growth of a plant be similarly stimulated? Those who are fond of gardening do find that if they love their plants, if they pay loving attention to the plant grows much faster and better. But then that may also be questioned. Of course, it is one feels that plants don't have the type of mind that human beings or rats and mice have. But all the same, if we go further down the evolutionary scale, the studies become more convincing in terms of proving that there is a unified field of consciousness, that there is a continuous consciousness, a continuity in consciousness between the person who is praying and the object of prayer, even if it is a plant. There have been studies on the willing, wishing, intending, or praying for increasing or decreasing the rate of multiplication of germs. And it has been found that, again, the effects are positive. Now, the germs probably could not be enjoying that extra attention or thinking that somebody is praying for me to grow faster or slower and therefore affecting the germ's body. This type of a thought. So, more convincing. But then still more convincing are studies on cell cultures where we don't have a germ, but just some cells which are being grown in a medium in which they get all the food, etc. And so the cells can multiply. And the multiplication of these cells can be the rate of multiplication of these cells can be increased or decreased by similar prayer, or as it's called more often in scientific studies, wishing, willing, or intending. So cell cultures, for example, cultures of cells taken from a cancerous tissue can increase or decrease their rate of multiplication in response to this type of an intention, a healing intention. So can this have an effect on a person who has cancer? If it can happen outside the body, can it also happen inside the body? That becomes a little more convincing than maybe even it can happen also within the body. Still more convincing are enzyme activity studies. Here you have an enzyme that is something which can bring about a chemical reaction, and those substances on which it can act to bring about the chemical reaction, that's called the substrate. So you have the enzyme and the substrate in the same tube. In the enzyme and the substrate in a tube, and then somebody wishes, wills, or intends that the rate of this chemical reaction should increase or decrease, and whatever is wished in this way seems to have some effect. So if even chemicals, non-living substances in a test tube can be affected in their behavior by this type of what is going on in the mind of a human being at a distance, one can sort of see that there is a good evidence for continuity of consciousness. Now, to sort of show it in a simple way, how it translates into the effect of prayer or wishing, willing, and intending by one person, be it a healer, be it a doctor, or an ordinary person, on a person's body who is sick. So A is the healer and B is the patient. And one can say that the mind of A is a subtle manifestation of the universal consciousness or the supreme consciousness of the divine. And the body of B is also a gross manifestation of the same, a gross manifestation of the divine. So A's mind is a subtle manifestation, B's body is a gross manifestation, but they are manifestations of the same supreme consciousness of the same divine. And the air that is separating them, that also is all pervaded by the same. And therefore, since they are all, the spirit of the divine is all pervasive, there's no real breach of continuity. A and B happen to be solid condensations of the same consciousness. So therefore, this subtle manifestation of consciousness in A, that is the mind, whatever goes on there, can influence through this consciousness, which is not an ordinary physical medium, the body of B, which is a gross manifestation of the same. So that's how this person's mind, the healer's mind, can affect the patient's body. Now, turning again to whether through all these studies we have a scientific proof, be they the findings in theoretical physics, be they the neurophysiological studies or these clinical studies, are they a scientific proof for the spiritual worldview, are a scientific proof of the supreme consciousness of the divine and the manifestation of that, reflection of that in the manifestation? Are they a proof of that? The data is consistent. Data of these studies is consistent with the worldview based on the spiritual consciousness. That is true. But being consistent does not, or having a correlation, having an association, does not prove a cause and effect relationship. Science has therefore been neither able to prove nor disprove the existence of God or the supreme consciousness. So if there is no real proof, what can be the attitude of scientists? One attitude can be that this altered consciousness, which the rishis and the mystics have reported in the past, in scriptures, etc., like the Upanishads, and which those experimented upon nuns and monks and yogis have shown, this altered state of consciousness does not really exist. It is only their hallucination. They are reporting something which actually does not exist. They're nothing like the divine, nothing like this all-pervasive spirit of the divine. It's all their hallucination. The other attitude can be, and this is the attitude of hardcore scientists, and therefore they in general are not interested in this type of studies. And if they study, their main aim seems to be to prove that the rishi or the mystic is wrong. The second possibility is that the altered consciousness does not perceive the truth. Yes, there is an altered state of consciousness, which the yogi or the rishi or the mystic or the nun or the monk has. But what they are reporting during that phase, the awareness of the divine or the awareness of the all-pervasive spirit of the divine, that is not really the truth. Something exists, but it is not a part of the truth. So the altered state of consciousness is not purely a hallucination, but all the same, they're not perceiving something that is true or something which is possible. And the third is an open-minded approach that this altered consciousness may perceive the truth. So although the hardcore scientists tend to have this attitude, in fact, you find that this attitude is the one which is more scientific, because one of the attributes of science is to remain open and to always believe that the limits of our knowledge are not the limits of truth. That is a basic dictum in the scientific philosophy. And it's only this success of the scientific enterprise that has so hypnotized us and sometimes infused science and scientists with such arrogance that they tend to have a very unscientific attitude, and they reject even the possibility of something existing which science has not been able to study, or science will not be able to study. And that is why Ravi Ravindra, who is himself a scientist, a spiritually oriented scientist, has said that during the European Renaissance, rationality had to be rescued from the clutches of the church. But now it seems the time has come when spiritual wisdom will have to be rescued from the clutches of science, from the clutches of orthodox science. So science itself has become orthodox in certain beliefs that if we don't know it, or if we will not be able to know it, if it is beyond our purview, then it does not exist. You know, it's something like this. If you have an object which is lost, but the lamp is somewhere else, one approach is that because I don't see it under the lamp, the object doesn't exist. The object is there in the dark, but all the same, the one who is only concentrating on what is visible under that lamp concludes that the object doesn't exist because I can't see it. So that is the approach of orthodox science. Whereas the other approach is that perhaps the object exists, but since I have only a lamp, let me start looking for the object under the lamp where the light is. So he's told that, well, the object is there, but it is not under the lamp. But he says, but this is the only place I can search properly. So that is the approach of scientists who go on studying consciousness with the tools that they have. And the third is the possibility that, well, I may study what is there under the lamp, but all the same, it's quite possible that the object that I'm looking for is not under the lamp, but somewhere in the dark. And I don't have the tools, I don't have that light, that bulb, which can illumine that dark area. So that is the open-minded scientific approach. Until we are able to discover that light, I'll go on conceding the possibility that maybe it exists. And if that does not exist, if somebody has that type of a lamp, an inner lamp, maybe if I use the same methods which that person has used, I'll also be able to see it. So that is the true scientific spirit. So it means that if I have to have the same experience as the rishi or the mystic, and I find that my methods as a scientist are inadequate and inappropriate for it, I should be willing to use the same methods. For example, if a scientist tells us that there are thousands of cells in a leaf, and I say that, well, I don't see those cells, all what I see is a green sheet of paper, something like a green sheet of paper, then the scientist will tell me that, well, I used a microscope to see the cells. So unless I'm willing to use the microscope, I'll not be able to see those cells. In the same way, the rishi or the mystic tells me that I have experienced it, and for that I used the methods of intense concentration and extreme degrees of self-purification. So unless I, as a scientist, am also willing to use the same methods, I cannot say that the experience of the rishi is a hallucination. That experience is impossible. Either I should use the same methods or just believe the rishi or the mystic that maybe by using those methods, this reality can be perceived. The next question that arises is scientific verification really necessary? It is not really necessary because science has a limited purview, and within that it has been very successful. But that is the realm of the physical world. And the physical world, as it can be observed through senses, unaided or aided by instruments. And within that, it has been able to discover a large amount of facts, a large fraction of the truth, a certain fraction of the truth, which is quite enough to give us the tools of even landing on the moon. That is true. But then it is only part of the truth. A part of the truth for which it has given us great depth and detail. But then the part, whereas the spiritual truth is the total truth. And the fraction need not certify or verify the total truth. That's beyond it. And therefore, scientific verification is not really necessary. And yet, these days, it sometimes appears that verification by science is a necessity. Why it seems necessary is because science has been a successful enterprise. It has revolutionized our lives. And therefore, one has started believing that being scientific is synonymous with being true. And therefore, if it is not scientific, it is not true. And that is why this sometimes seems necessary, although it is not. Now, here the spiritual enthusiasts also sometimes make a mistake in their enthusiasm and their emotional attachment to the spiritual wisdom. And they take two contradictory stands. One is spirituality discovered all of science long ago. So if there's a study which shows something unique about the yogis or the rishis or the mystics or the nuns and the monks, studies of that type, they say, well, science has discovered these spiritual truths only now, or they've started conceding them only now. Spirituality, rishis and mystics discovered it thousands of years ago. So in other words, at least we have the precedence. Why precedence by itself actually does not really have a good, solid, rational claim to superiority, because if something has been discovered by another alternative means, even if it is later, but it is original in its own discovery, then the precedence does not matter. If two people, without knowing what the other discovered, discover the same thing a few thousand years apart, precedence by itself does not constitute superiority. But all the same, that is the type of stand that is taken. And on the other hand, the same spiritual enthusiasts take the stand, well, see, look, now science has proven these spiritual truths. Now, if spirituality is superior to science, it discovered it long ago, it discovered the total truth, whereas science is discovering only part of the truth, then why does this wisdom require certification by science? I'll end this with a little poem. I'm not a poet, but sometimes I get some rhyming expressions. I get them, they come to me from outside, and I give expression to them. And they may be just rhymes, but all the same, I call them poems. And since this course has been about the human body, which one may consider to be a machine, I'll go through this poem with you. Using a gadget is great, but making the machine is greater still. So we only use our machine, the human machine. The machine is made in the mother's womb. So that is something much greater than using it. Inventing the instrument, however, needs the greatest skill. And who invented this instrument? The divine. Using a gadget is great, but making the machine is greater still. Inventing the instrument, however, needs the greatest skill. Life is a machine invented by the divine. Into matter he injects life to make it a tool divine. The role of we mortals is the simplest of all. Use the machine to fulfill his plans, big and small. So basically, we arrive as instruments. Our tasks are given to us when we are born, how we will fulfill his plans so that our soul can evolve and continue its onward journey from life to life. Do his bidding is easier said than done. So although the mission is given to us at birth, to do what we need to do is easier said than done, because the road to his plans is blocked by bullies more than one. The first bully is ego, a bloated balloon. Puncture it as you may, it fills itself soon. The second bully is desire, a multiplying tribe. Oust one and find two, begging for a bribe. Despair not, for there are friends. These friends, they can facilitate the journey to his ends. The first friend is surrender. Silence your mind and you will hear his voice clear and kind. Reason no more, do what he says. Conflict only clouds the vision. He takes, you anyway end up where he takes. The second friend is merger. There is, after all, the same divine spark in beings big and small. So that merger comes through love. Love induces intimacy, feel like giving, and that love in turn is based on a sense of oneness. The second friend is merger. There is, after all, the same divine spark in beings big and small. If you are in pain, I should weep as well. Your moments of joy should make my heart swell. Merger is easy to preach, but difficult to practice. That my needs come first is very easy to establish. To fit into his plans, there are thus dictums for no ego, no desire. So keep these bullies away, keep them under control. And if the ego is under control, the desires are very easy to control, because much of our desires are meant to boost our ego. So the desires lose their intensity when they lose that support. No ego, no desire. And then the positive tools are total surrender, merge more with the rest of the creation. Now, what has science done? It has added depth and detail to spiritual wisdom, but all the same, it cannot prove or disprove it. It keeps scratching the surface. Science reveals to us how minute is the care, how cunning the device, how intense the absorption it bestows upon the smallest of its works, even as on the largest. So I've seen during the last few weeks what a wonderful machine the human machine is, and how much care has gone into it. And the care that the divine has bestowed does not depend upon the size or the importance that we human beings ascribe to a creation, to one of the works of the divine. The divine has bestowed the same amount of care. And as we saw, the basic processes of life, which are so uniquely designed, are essentially the same in a single celled animal as in the human being. So, even that single celled animal, the amoeba, or for that matter, even a lump of clay, it has received the same amount of care as the largest and what we consider to be the best creation so far, the human being. Why I said even a lump of clay is because there's a little sort of a concocted story which is which talks about the clay. Once a group of scientists, they finally, starting with a lump of clay, could create life. And they said, see, we have been able to do what God has done. We have also been able to create life from something non-living, just a lump of clay. So we have created life. And then God heard it and told them, just hold on, son. First, bring your own clay. So who created the clay? When the scientist says that the brain is so wired as to give us to this type of an experience, who wired that brain? Who was that master electrician? That is the question that sometimes we forget to ask in our human arrogance. But the divine does not care. The care that it bestows is on crafting us, is on the care that he shows is in helping us continue the onward journey of the soul. And if we are able to do that, we not only find that the journey moves on, we also find that life becomes much more pleasant. It becomes filled with love, peace, and joy, and a sense of fulfillment. Science reveals to us how minute is the care, how cunning the device, how intense the absorption it bestows upon the smallest of its works, even as on the largest. I'm not calling it thank you or the end, because that gives an impression as if we are signing off. Because, as I said in the beginning, our relationship would continue. And this was just sort of a summing up today of some of the related things which bridge science and spirituality. And consciousness is probably one of those subjects which can do it the best. So that's why I ended up talking a bit about it. So with this, now I hand over to Aditi for continuing further.
Yes, and then I will hand it over to the participants for continuing further with asking questions. And so anybody who has any question, they can either write it or share it. And also, since we will have, as Sir said, interval, if you have any feedback or anything you want to share, you can briefly share that as well. So yes, please go ahead.
Hello, good morning.
Yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, Manju. Yes, Manju.
Good morning, sir and team. First, thank you so much for such a blissful experience of your attending your session. You all are very, very blessed. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you so much. The other thing I want to clear, why is there so much of scatteredness in the thought and so much of cloudiness in thoughts? And in the same flow, I want to ask why visualization is so poor in some persons.
lack of clarity, vacillation, these are characteristics of the intellect. Because we are so constituted, and these are characteristics in a way of partial knowledge. It's only when the intellect gets anchored to that which has the total knowledge and which we have within us, our divine essence is the soul. So it's only when the intellect is anchored to the when the intellect is anchored to the soul that these things will tend to reduce and finally disappear one day.
Thank you so much. And you're already clear in this session very much, when we about the consciousness. Thank you so much. It means a lot to me. Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you so much.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Bijlani, Aditi, and to the entire YES team. It's been a beautiful way to start the mornings, and heartful thanks for that, for all your effort and the consistency that goes into it. I have a query or more a comment. Is there a way in which we can reflect or introspect and know if we are growing in our consciousness or regressing? Are there ways in which we can keep that radar on?
Saying that strictly speaking, there is no way one can measure these things. You can't say that the consciousness has grown by 1 kilo or 1 kilometer. But all the same, that type of efforts have been made. David Hawkins has tried to quantify consciousness by measuring, the way the muscle tone increases or decreases. Anything genuine leads to a relaxation of effort and relaxation of the muscles and so on. So from that, one can make out. And also, it's relaxed, but at the same time gives us an inner strength. So that strength also gets reflected in those kinesiological studies. Whereas when anything not genuine or any falsehood, anything fake, makes us feel drained and weak. And that also shows in these kinesiological studies. So through that, he has tried to quantify. But on a more ordinary level, some of the tests which, one of the most important indicators of this is equanimity, being able to stay at peace in all circumstances. This is one of the indicators. And for that, we always would feel that maybe there is still more scope. And have I really made any progress? But then if we really make an effort, one can reflect back and say that maybe if I were in the similar circumstances in 10 years ago, would I have reacted in the same way? Would I have been as cool and composed as I am today? If the answer is no, 10 years ago, I would have been much more upset by the same thing. Then so we have made some progress. Or in the same way, while making choices, choices at the level of the mind or the choices at the level of the soul. Now, if today I make a choice at the level of the soul, and I reflect back, and I feel that maybe 10 years ago in a similar situation, I would have made a choice at the level of the emotions or the intellect rather than at the level of the soul. So I feel that, yes, I have made some progress. So there are some ways in which best by reflection, one can have some idea of the progress. But the most important thing is not to worry too much about the progress. Leave the progress to the divine. Yeah, we keep doing what we have to do. Or as they say, keep your eye on the ball, not on the scoreboard.
Thank you so much. That's very heartening to know. Thank you, Dr. Bijlani. Thank you, Aditi.
Thank you, Bijlani sir, Aditi ji, and all the teachers. The kind of the wisdom that we have got from YES 1, 2, and 3 is something which cannot be really expressed in terms of words. So many, many thanks, heartfelt thanks to all of you and all the participants for asking beautiful questions. I was not able to ask certain questions, but these questions were asked by other people, and in turn I benefited a lot. I know that I have progressed to some extent, but I have also regressed too. So I take this as a process of going up and coming down. So, but the journey continues. So I, as rightly suggested by Bijlani sir, I leave it to divine. Where I'm going, I mean, I'll leave it to entirely to him. So it is up to his wishes. I keep doing whatever is best in the solution, in the situation, as per the whatever level of consciousness that I have got. Thank you so much, madam. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been a very active participant and a very candid and frank participant. And once again, you repeated it, and you brought out an important point that not only we progress further on this path, we also can go back. So it's not a steady progress. It's back and forth, sometimes one step forwards and two steps backwards, sometimes two
Yes.
steps forwards, one step backwards, a zigzag path. It's an unsteady path. And to admit that also is an act of courage and sincerity. And apart from that, you said that you learned a lot from other people's questions. So again, shows our oneness and unity. Basically, we are all one. And therefore, it's we gain something by giving love. We gain something by receiving love. That is what it is about, giving and receiving. Life is basically about recycling rather than generating anything new. That's what I'm also doing all the time. I received it from the divine through many other instruments, and I'm trying to sort of do my best in again being another channel to transmit it to some more. That's all.
You are creating micro channels in us. Thank you, sir. micro channels.
If I can ask a question, Dr. Bijlani, let me join everybody else in thanking you profusely for, and the Aurobindo Ashram for these absolutely fantastic sessions, and for the recordings, because one wants to go back and listen again and again in order to understand the nitty-gritties of what you've said in various sessions. My question is on fasting. A lot of people use fasting as a means, to progress on the spiritual path. I am unable to fast at all, no fasts. And, people also use fasting as a means of what they call autophagy, or trying to deal with dead cells or remove dead cells in the body, and etc. And I don't know, whether fasting is really important, or whether it messes up your system or can mess up your system, as for example, the case where somebody fasted for 21 days recently and lived only on water.
There are two aspects to your question. One is the spiritual aspect, and the other is the biological aspect. Spiritually speaking, fasting will serve as a tool of sadhana, one of the tools for sadhana, only if it is done with the right attitude, as with everything else. Which means that if this fasting is done with the idea of developing self-control, self-discipline, if it is done with the idea of awareness of the others who are not getting enough food, and as an act of empathizing with them who are not getting enough food, then it will serve
shawl cloth.
Just some disturbance somewhere. So I was talking about whether fasting will serve the spiritual purpose as a tool of sadhana, only if it is done with the right attitude. And the right attitude would be that I'm doing it to develop self-control, self-discipline, overcome my attachment to sensory pleasure. Or if I do it with the intention of empathizing with those who are not getting enough food, then it will be a tool of sadhana, not otherwise. Otherwise, it may only end up boosting my ego that I'm doing a spiritual practice and therefore I have become one notch above those who are not fasting. That will not be a part of sadhana. So now the biological aspect. Biologically, we are all made differently. And some of us have a greater capacity to fast than others. And this Ayurveda people know in much greater detail. And therefore, there are certain people with a certain prakriti whom they tell that you need not fast. So if you do not have that type of a capacity to fast, doesn't matter. One doesn't have to fast. And you can further consult an Ayurveda expert to find out whether you just have this psychological dependence on food, or whether your Prakriti demands that you do not fast. Now, if a person's Prakriti demands that the person does not fast, that does not mean that the person is deprived of an important tool in sadhana. Because that is one of the beauties of the yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the mother. Everything is permissible. Everything which can serve as a tool in sadhana is permissible. But at the same time, nothing is strictly prescribed. So one can carve one's own path, keeping with one's inclinations, temperament, and capacity. So if one does not have the capacity to fast, your sadhana can be without fasting. So it's not essential. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? So Aditi, maybe you can now continue and make whatever announcements need to be made on the last day.
Yes, no, just two quick announcement or request, whatever you would like to perceive. All the recordings of all the 3 courses are available on YouTube. So in case you would like to share them further with your friend circle or your students or colleagues, it will be nice if you can do that. And since this course is a free offering from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, in case you are inspired to donate any amount, you can just write to us on the email ID shared, and we can share some bank details with you. And also for the December month, we will not be having any sessions or the talks, but we'll be resuming it in January, and you will be getting more on the YouTube channel January onwards. And about the next course, Yes.04, Dr. Bijlani will be sharing the details. So yes.
The next course, Yes.04, will be more application oriented. There'll be a continuity between the two. In this one, the emphasis was more on pure science, biological sciences, with some idea of application. In the next one, the emphasis will be on application, and with a little bit of science sort of to understand the application. So the emphasis will change, and the main emphasis will be on lifestyle diseases, obesity, overweight, which is the mother of all lifestyle diseases, high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, peptic ulcer, and we'll take up migraine. We'll take up some such examples of lifestyle diseases, talk and try to understand those diseases, because understanding itself helps us in managing those diseases and preventing them also if we don't have. We'll understand them and also look at yoga from a comprehensive point of view in how yoga can help us prevent and manage these diseases. That's what Yes.04 will be like. And tentatively, we'll start on the 12th of January, 2023, and finish sometime towards the end of February. So that will be the duration of the Yes.04. And in the meantime, as Aditi said, this month we will not be having Yes talks, but we are both doing together. Aditi is the major sort of facilitator in that. A course titled Human Identity as the Doorway to Human Unity. So understanding of who we are as human beings helps us unify with the rest of the creation. So that is the doorway to human unity. So that is the sort of the broad title. And under that, we'll have weekend sessions for the next 4 weeks, for the next 1 month or so. Yes. So that will be the other offering, which is a part of a network called the Sri Aurobindo Integral Education Network. In that, the seats are limited and the seats are all full. But soon after those sessions, we'll again try to upload those sessions, the recordings of those sessions on the same channel, Yes Spirituality. So you can still watch the recordings of those. And apart from the recordings of that course, some short videos we'll keep posting almost on a daily basis. So if you keep visiting the channel, you will have plenty of new material to watch on the channel till we start Yes.04, or the mother willing, on the 12th of January. And as Aditi said, I mean, you are free to make any donations to Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, for which we'll be happy to send you the bank details if you write an email to us. Aditi, have I missed anything, or you would like to add anything to continue?
No, I think we have covered all the points, and it's a good time to end with a moment of silence and a collective gratitude offering. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making it all possible. Thank you.
Thank you.